All right. Welcome everybody to the October session of Clinical Research Connections. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to start off today with a couple of quick poll questions, and that'll help us get to know our audience and your familiarity with the various roles and your role in the community at CU and with research. So Natasha, if you would go ahead and launch the first poll, we're going to be asking, what role in research do you serve in the CU community? And I'll give everybody just a couple of moments to answer that. Right. For those of you who are just joining, we're currently launching a poll regarding everybody's role in our research community. This will help us get to know who's here and how you interact with the CU research community in your role. Oh, Catherine, thank you for that feedback. A multiple choice option might be a good idea to include in the future. I appreciate that. All right. Natasha, if you are ready to share those results. Okay. Lots of PRAs, PIs, clinical research, administrators. Excellent. Looks like a great diverse group of roles. And now that we know you a little bit better and your role with the university, we'll launch another poll and ask you how long you've been with us. So I'll give everybody a moment to answer that as well. And if anybody is having any trouble seeing the polls or answering them, or if you have any questions, please let us know in the chat. All right. Natasha, if you're ready to share those results as well, thank you. Lots of folks are new to the research community, and then many folks have been with us for many, many years. So thank you for sharing that and for allowing us to get to know you a little bit better. So we have a couple of speakers today that we're grateful for joining us. And we're going to start off with Sam Ellis from the Research Pharmacy, who's going to talk to us a little bit about updates in drug check policy. Sam, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Erin. Appreciate that. Let me just share my screen with everyone real quick. All right. Welcome, everyone. I was asked to give just kind of a quick update on the research pharmacy and where things stand, and then also talk about a new policy that's in draft form that may impact individuals on various research teams that administer medication as part of their study. So the CU Research Pharmacy, for those of you who don't know, it's up and operational. We received all our certifications about 2 months ago now for the clean room side of our enterprise. And so if you have new studies or existing studies that you need to transition over to us, if we've not reached out to you, please do so. We're happy to get involved with projects as they are in the grant planning process. So just email research.pharmacy@cuanschutz.edu. We'd be happy to meet with you prior to your submissions of your grants. But obviously, once you receive funding, then again, please reach out to us with as much notice as you can. And we're definitely busy right now transitioning and picking up new studies. So it's a exciting time for us in the research pharmacy. To transition just a little bit to the draft policy for independent double check of investigational and high alert medication administration. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. This is a policy that's been in works for a while and really stemmed from a background standpoint to or from the move of the CTRC and other research enterprises to more of a CU Denver or CU Anschutz building or campus. And as a result of some of those moves, the UCH EPIC system hasn't been in place or won't be in place right now. And so we wanted to make sure that we were drafting a policy that we could use not only for those few research units that were moving away from UCH EPIC, but also that one that could be viable for the rest of the campus. And so this new policy is in draft form, but the ultimate goal is we want to make sure that we're ensuring safety not only of our patients, but also of the providers and the research team members who are administering investigational products or other what we call high alert medications, those medications that have been vetted and deemed to be high risk from a patient safety standpoint, but also from a provider or nursing standpoint who might be administering those products. So what we have been working towards in this policy is looking at existing evidence and research that has been in place for many years. And we've adapted policy around this independent double check process. So these are kind of procedural SOPs that have been established and well studied and shows that it reduces medication errors by ensuring appropriate drug, appropriate patient, what we call in the pharmacy world, the 5 rights, but also making sure that it goes through appropriate vetting of nurses to make sure that if there have been changes to infusion rates, for example, or other aspects of the patient that may alter the administration of the drug, that those have been duly noted and the prescription is appropriate and what's coming from pharmacy is appropriate as well. So this independent double check policy requires completion by 2 qualified staff. So, and we're saying that those staff need to be within the study, one of which has to be the administering nurse. And both the nurse who's administering the drug or the team member who's administering the drug and the second independent check person need to review the independent double check process independently so they make sure to arrive at the same conclusion. And then this, once it's done prior to administering of the investigational product or high alert medication, needs to be recorded in an appropriate source documentation. In the policy that we have drafted, we also have kind of this checklist form. So these are the things that we're asking research teams to independently review. So we have reviewer 1 and reviewer 2. In our discussions with different research teams across campus with this, I think most research teams have said they're doing this already and that this isn't anything new. It's just maybe the way it's being documented or how it's being delivered to the rest of the campus. So I don't know that this would really change a lot of research practices that are in place. But again, just realize that we're doing this for a number of reasons across the CU system to ensure that our providers, our nurses, and patients are being safe. Okay. So that's really my overview of that policy. I'm sure there's some questions with that. So I'd be happy to take any questions that people may have. feel free to put anything in chat or unmute and ask those questions.
Sam, this is Joanna at the Health and Wellness Center. Just wondering for investigational drugs that participants are taking themselves, will study staff also be required to fill out this form?
So great question. Thank you for asking it. At this point in time, no, it's really to protect the patients from and nurses and providers from drugs that we're administering on site. So if we're dispensing an oral medication for the patient to administer at home, or maybe you even give the person a bottle and they take the first dose in front of you, but they're doing that themselves, no. The only exception with that would be if it was one of the medications on the high alert list, which is part of the policy. We have that as well. I can kind of show that to you if you guys have any interest. Let me just do that real quick. So these are some of the different medications that are on this list here. And we've worked closely with UCH to develop the list. And it's not necessarily all inclusive, and obviously this will be modified, but just so you all know, it is part of the policy. So we'll make sure to continue to update that list. Great question, thank you.
We have a couple of questions from the chat. Janine asks, how do people get access to that form?
It'll go out as part of the policy once it kind of comes out of draft. And we'll make sure that that's linked and posted to the campus policy site.
Oh, great, thank you. And Aaron asks, if the research staff are providing the nurse the drug to give to the patient, does the nurse need to sign off on the drug as well? Or is it sufficient to have 2 research staff sign off on the, for example, PRA and pharmacists?
It's still doesn't include the pharmacists. This is separate. We obviously do our own independent checks or double checking systems within the pharmacy, but we are asking that the nurse and an additional staff member sign off on that if it's going to be administered to the patient.
Okay, so the nurse in UC Health needs to sign off as well as the research staff. We just have a pharmacist on our trials as well, an independent pharmacist on our trials.
Oh, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, if you have a pharmacist on your trial, then they can sign off on those.
Okay,
yep.
Perfect. And then, so the nurse that's administering the drug, does she need to sign off as well?
Yes.
Okay, just
so yeah, most importantly, the nurse who's administering needs to sign off. That
okay,
needs to be
perfect.
one of the 2 checks for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Right, great. Thank you so much, Sam.
Great.
And now we will have a quick update on the CTRC survey from Janine. So I'll go ahead and take it away, Janine. Janine, I think you're muted. Janine, are you with us? Are you able to unmute? All right. Janine's mic is not working. So I will just we'll leave the slide up on the screen for just a moment so that people can capture the QR code. But for now, we will move on to our,
Erin, can I just add that this user satisfaction survey for the CTRC, more details will be in Dr. Flagg's research bulletin that will be coming out later today as well. So more details around that will appear. But in the meantime, if folks could take a look at that QR code and provide some comment, that would be great, because the feedback is really necessary for data moving forward and for funding opportunities as well. So thank you all.
Yes, thank you. We really appreciate your feedback on that survey. So now we will move on to Melissa Handel, who is going to tell us a little bit about the upcoming NIH data sharing requirements that will be beginning in early 2023. Melissa, feel free to take it away.
Hey, everybody. Okay. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so it's really great to be here with you all today. I apologize that I'm at an NIH meeting today, so there might be some background noise. So today we're going to tell you a little bit about some work that we've been coordinating to help get the campus ready for the new NIH data management and sharing plan. These slides will be made available at the link that is there. If somebody could grab that link and put it in the chat, or I'll do so afterwards, that would be terrific. So first, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about why we care so much about this new plan and what it means to all of us in the research community. So fundamentally, we want to go from practice-based evidence to evidence-based practice. So what this means is, in terms of data sharing, is that we have patient encounters over here on the left. We generate data from those patient encounters. These can be deposited into clinical warehouses such as Health Data Compass. Those data and other combined patient focused data end up in registries, are used for basic research. Basic research generates a lot of other data. And together, all of these data, fundamentally, we derive inferences from them and create medical knowledge, which then goes on to be managed in such a way that we want to integrate that knowledge and those data to inform clinical guidelines, to help support clinical decision support and other expert systems to better improve patient care. And all of this virtuous cycle depends upon having comparable and consistent information, which requires harmonized data. And so fundamentally, the NIH data sharing policy that's coming out in January of 2023 aims to really make this cycle more efficient. So this is the fundamental goal. And we as an institution want to also do this for ourselves. So it's a good, the new policy is a good thing for everyone in the sense that it will help us make better use of our own data for ourselves, as well as for the biomedical research enterprise writ large. So it's important to recognize that the data's reuser's perspective is equally as important as the data providers. So we often think a lot about how we manage our data for ourselves. We plan a lot of things. We write our IRBs, we have data management plans, we collect data, we have our forms, we use REDCap, we document things, we analyze things, and maybe we share them when we write manuscripts or in the context of clinical research, if we are, have pending drugs for the FDA, we would share it with federal agencies. But what we often don't think much about is how others might reuse our data to discover, access, combine, reanalyze, and share new results from the combinations of those reanalyses. So many of you have heard about FAIR, which is the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable sort of mantra that NIH has really adopted. And this is really about sort of making data fundamentally more useful to us all. I wanted to talk today a little bit more about the R part, because the reusability is really what the new NIH data sharing plan is getting after. And this requires a little bit of TLC. And what I mean by TLC is traceability, licensure, and connectedness. So I'm going to say a few words about each and give you some examples so that for your own research areas that you have some fodder and some food for thought for how you might be able to achieve FAIR or FAIR TLC. So traceability has to do with evidence, provenance, and attribution. We really want to understand, where did our data come from, what happened to it, and who contributed to it. And the reason for that is so that we can support rigor and reproducibility in the face of those clinical decision support systems that we aim to support, but also so that we give credit to those who have contributed to what is essentially the bucket brigade of science in terms of how we handle our data and use it for maximum impact. Licensing is about how we can use others' data. Is the license for using data clearly stated? Is it comprehensive and non-negotiated? Is it accessible? Can you even find the license for the data that you aim to use? Does it avoid restrictions on the kinds of reuse or who may reuse? And these are all considerations that we need to not only think about when we are using someone else's data, but when we are ourselves providing data to others. And then, of course, there's connected, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. So whether the data is open or closed for reuse is often impossible to know until you try. And the trial often comes at significant legal expense since most licenses are missing, vague, or restrictive. This is an example of licensing burden from my group working on a project where we, through a very complex set of data integration strategies to build clinical decision support tools for clinical genetics, bring together very many resources worth of data. The institutions that are involved in the creation of these of this final clinical decision support and other tools integrate all the data sources on the right, and yet the number of institutions has even grown since I made this slide. Those are the number of legal relationships that one might potentially have to have in order to make sure that those data from those individual sources are fundamentally reusable. And what I mean by reusable is I mean redistributable in the context of that clinical decision support tool. So this is the part about that reuse of knowledge for clinical decision support that I had on the first slide. So we really need to grease the wheels on the licensing and make this process easier by making each one of those lines easier for the end user who's using the data. So there's a project called the Reusable Data Project, and you can go to see more about this project at reusabledata.org. And basically what it says is your license clearly stated? Is it comprehensive and non-negotiated? Is it accessible? Does it avoid the restrictions on kinds of reuse? And who may reuse? As I mentioned, we need to make sure that we document these things for others to be able to use our data. And when we use others' data, we need to make sure that we understand those terms so that we're not violating any legal restrictions. This Reusable Data Project provides a rubric to basically evaluate the status of data for reusability. And so for those of you who are interested in selecting the proper license for sharing your data, or are concerned that a resource that you may wish to reuse yourself has the proper legal redistribution terms, you can go to this reusabledata.org website and find out more about how to perform those evaluations. So the selection of licenses for data has major implications about which data can be legally reused together. Permissively licensed data is like a universal donor. It doesn't get much back from more restrictively licensed, whereas restrictively licensed data can only be combined with permissively licensed data, not most other restrictively licensed data. And this is actually a graph showing all the different data licenses that we found in those sources I presented earlier, and which ones may be legally redistributed with each other versus those that cannot. So it's a really complex legal environment. And for the most part, the maturity of the community in terms of defining licenses for data is still quite immature. But we as a campus aim to do well by this, and NIH is incentivizing us to declare our licenses for maximal reuse. So now to the connected part. This is about identifiers, data models, ontologies, and other standards, and clinical data elements. So data integrators have a unique and vital perspective because of the vast data that varies in quality and value. There are many different actors and disciplines and remits and contributors. There are many different kinds of resources to get data from. There are many data types shown over here on this x-axis. And when you look at those all together, you realize that there's really, while the data are somewhat interconnected, there's no universally recognized boundaries. And when you look closer, you see that the relationships between data and different sources are inconsistent, duplicative, or riddled with broken and fragile links. This is really about good identifier hygiene. And there is a manuscript here that was a community standards manuscript about if you are sharing data and you need to give DOIs or other persistent identifiers to those data that are linked to those licenses that I mentioned, or any other mentions of key resources within your data set, such as genetic variants or data files, that these identifiers meet the standards for persistence and reuse when combined with other data downstream. Okay, so that's the background about like things to consider and think about in your own research for how to do a good job of sharing data. Now we need to think about what are we doing to plan for the NIH data management and sharing plan that comes out January 25th. So data collection, what data types will be generated in your research project? We need to align the data collection information with the specific aims that are in the application for your research proposals to NIH. So for example, you might declare omics data, clinical data, imaging data, or flow cytometry data. Data management question, how will these data be managed? Your plan should have a plan to maintain the data throughout the project, for example, in a lab or an institute's data core or in a data coordinating center or on an on-premises resource or in the cloud. For data sharing, which data files are most useful for broad uses in the research community? Which data will be needed for new research projects to avoid duplication or to supplement existing experiments? And then finally, for the writing part, are all data management and sharing plan elements addressed, such as data, repositories, and costs? All of the costs in the budget are going to be in the budget justification or otherwise in an institutional statement of resources. And this might include things like data formatting or curation. It's also important to comment that not all managed data needs to be shared for secondary use. So this is NIH funded research data that we're talking about here. So just an overview of what the new policy contains. And again, there are links here and also on the NIH website that I will provide in a minute. The new plan has some really key features. It applies to all research funded in whole or in part by NIH that results in the generation of scientific data, including grants, contracts, or other transactions. It does not apply to research and other activities that do not generate scientific data, such as training, infrastructure development, and non-research activities. So by that, you might think like, if you have a training program, that's not the data about your training program is not required to apply to the data management sharing plan. The data management sharing plan is recommended to be 2 pages long. I have been consistently told by NIH that that is a recommendation and not a requirement, but it doesn't yet actually say that in the policy. So we're not entirely sure yet as a community whether or not NIH will actually limit the submissions to 2 pages. The 2 pages for very large DCCs is probably not enough to describe the full roadmap for what you would want to have for a very large program. But it's nice if it is indeed the fact that for the smaller programs that we don't have to write excessively long documents. So to be determined on whether or not the limit will be 2 pages or if that's just a recommendation. It is not a scored component of the proposal. Now that said, because of the new plan, it's still the case that your overall score on your research proposals could potentially be influenced by the quality of your data sharing plan, but it doesn't get a score as part of the review process. The data management sharing plan can contain justified uncertainties. So for example, if you don't really quite know for certain what the governance will be or what the storage mechanism will be, that's perfectly fine. You can put different options or how that process will be determined. And then the data management plan will be updated annually, and you can update those things as you determine them as part of the research program. The annual notice of award for a research program is dependent on your RPPR reporting on compliance to the awardee's data management plan and other NIH data sharing policies. So essentially, you will have to show similar to your regular RPPR components when you have an annual report that you have been meeting your objectives, that you have scientific productivity, et cetera. There will be a new section in the RPPR that will allow you to demonstrate that you have met the goals of your stated data management and sharing plan. And this is something that can be discussed and negotiated with your program officer. The grant budgets may include costs for preserving and sharing data, including personnel and storage costs. These funds must be spent during the funding period. So if you want to have funds for long-term preservation, you need to make arrangements to pay for that long-term preservation before the end of the funding period. The scientific data should be made accessible as soon as possible and no later than the time of an associated publication or at the end of a performance period, whichever comes first. This is a very, very short summary of the very long documentation that NIH has provided. I think I've hit all the salient points. Definitely welcome discussion and just again noting that the policy is still as policy and associated documentation on the NIH website are still being updated. And so we will plan to continue to share information as we get it with you all. So the template, what's in the template? So just to give you a hint, there is a draft that has been posted on the NIH data sharing website. It has not been yet finalized, but the draft has these categories and we do not anticipate that these categories will change. So the first element contains data types. What is the type, amount, which data will be preserved and shared, metadata and documentation information. Element 2 contains information about tools, software, and code. And I should mention that both element 1 and 2 have to do with many of the features that I talked about with the TLC. What is the licensing? What are the metadata and identifiers? And what's the sort of findability and connectivity of those data? Element 3 is which data standards will be utilized. Element 4 is about data preservation, access, and timelines for sharing and preservation. Element 5 is factors affecting access, distribution, or reuse of scientific data, and controlled access and privacy considerations as necessary for your IRB. Element 6 is institutional compliance, monitoring, and roles. And we plan to provide templates for many of these features where institutional considerations are concerned as part of our role in helping coordinate our campus's readiness. So we can, in my role as the Chief Research Information Officer, we convened a CREO Council that represents a cross-campus and hospital-inclusive governance council that supports coordination functions across campus and with our hospital partners. And one of the things that we have been doing over the last several months is convening a working group to understand what are the necessary requirements to prepare our campus. This working group is open to others, and we would welcome participation if there are members of our audience today who would like to help contribute to help identify all of the key preparations that need to be made in order to realize our readiness. We will continue to update the working group's activities on our CREO website page that's listed there. It's on the Research Office website. And then I just wanted to kind of go over a few steps of things that we have already identified and are already underway in terms of how we're going to support you all and your research in adhering to the new data sharing policy. The first is identifying best practices in selecting public data repositories for data dissemination, either generalist data repositories or for specific data types, such as those on the NIH website. And the general repositories are things like Vivly or Figshare or Dryad, whereas specific data types might be things like Geo for GWAS data, and so or clinicaltrials.gov for clinical trials registration. So the NIH website has a very long laundry list of these, and we'll be creating some guidance for helping to select those. The nice thing about using these public repositories is for the most part, they are free for data storage. And so we like to support our federally funded repositories in that context. We will be providing a library of templates and examples for different data types and institutional language blurbs that you can put in your specific sections of the data management and sharing plan, and a best practice guide and templates for funding requests on grants to cover costs beyond what the institution would normally provide. We'll have an inventory of campus locations where data can be stored and shared for controlled public access and or metadata records. Some examples are the library, CEDA, Health Data Compass, the BBRC, et cetera. And these will include documentation of how that infrastructure is supported by personnel and financial cost models. So it may not cost the same to store data in different ways at different levels of support in these different contexts. And so we want to make sure we align the needed support from you all as a researcher with the sort of actual costs that these resources would provide to you. And it just depends on the requirements of your research programs and the requirements of the specific data types. We had a council, the CREO Council had a survey out over the summer and through the end of September. We have left it open to keep collecting information from you all about what sorts of data management needs you all have. And so happy to hear from you all in that context. And we have council delegates from each school that are sussing out additional information to help understand what researcher needs are from each school. We will be providing concierge services and training to help researchers in the creation of their data management sharing plans, as well as how to be compliant to them on an annual basis, and working with the pre-award staff and OGC in order to help them help you in the context of budgeting and financial management associated with data management, and then otherwise hosting town halls to further understand campus needs. So this is from the NIH, and so they have a central data sharing website, which is essentially a one-stop shop for information about the data management and sharing plan. There's lots of tools and kits there. We don't want to duplicate these resources, but rather customize them for our use in the context of our CU community. But there's some great ways to find out more information. You can sign up for training events and webinars, and there's also a central mailbox to ask questions. So we have a couple questions for you, and then I'm happy to take questions in the chat or if anyone wants to speak up. So the first question is, what are your biggest challenges in sharing data? And I'm just going to try to escape out of this so I can see the chat. If anybody wants to let us know what your biggest challenges are, we would be really happy to answer questions. Thanks, Stephen, for posting the link.
So I work as the assistant director for data operations for my center. And so I spend a lot of time writing DUAs, DTUAs, MTAs, and all of those kinds of agreements. And all of our data currently require those kinds of agreements for people who are using data outside of the university. Would this change require us to no longer do that? Or do we only have to do those for data requested through us? Or will we have to make everything available that's de-identified?
So it's a good question, and it's definitely going to be on a case-by-case basis to some extent. Your regulatory requirements will not change. You will still go through the regulatory and compliance office to submit your IRBs and your DTAs and your DUAs. However, what will change are two things. One is the way in which that's documented in your data management and sharing plan. You'll need to put a little blurb about those activities into that section that I showed earlier for how the data will be managed and shared. And then the second thing I would say is that one of the, and this is an open question that many in the community have had of NIH, and so we don't have perfect answers yet. And it's also the case that NIH themselves is still kind of receiving feedback and going to kind of see how things go. But essentially, many times when we have non-de-identified data, it's not possible, obviously, to readily share that with the community. But that doesn't mean that you can't share metadata information about the study information or what data is actually available. And compliant with your IRB, you are of course allowed to share data consistent with that. I think what's less clear is what they're expecting in terms of sharing de-identified data or synthetic data that might be derived. And again, I think that's kind of going to be on a more case-by-case basis, but there is no anticipation or expectation that there's a requirement to share identifiable data under any circumstances that are otherwise outside your plans in your IRB. So hopefully that alleviates some concerns. And again, I think it's one thing we can do to help you all with that is just to create metadata records just to show that it exists and you're doing your due diligence, that it's available for sharing, as opposed to waiting for a manuscript to come out 9 months later or something like that. Okay, we have a couple more questions, and just in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on to the next one. So very large data sets take a long time to transfer off our clusters, and since we are behind VPNs and don't have a university Globus account, we can't be efficient in the transfer process. So I think in this case, this is another case, even though they're not necessarily identifiable data, very large data sets that have no public location where they can be stored. And we've had this problem in the past as well. Basically, we can do the same kind of thing. You can either share a sampling of the data or a metadata record about the data, and then provision otherwise whatever you would normally provision for access control. The policy is not expecting all data to be publicly available, in an instant. It's more about the management and the sharing its existence that seems to be more the focus. So for sensitive data or very large data or very challenging data to put out in the public domain, it's perfectly fine to continue to manage it in the best way possible that you've already been doing. How is this different from the resource sharing plans requirements already informed G? That's a very good question. And we are uncertain what how those are going to split out in the new grant submission. But it is my anticipation that they would be separated so that things like antibodies or model organisms for resource sharing would be in a separate resource sharing plan from the data management and sharing plan. Let's see, what resources will be available on campus and how much it will cost for R01 type metabolic and imaging data to comply beyond what CU is supplying. So we are currently undertaking some assessment of what resources we have on campus, how they're being financed, what changes might need to be made in order to that landscape in order to best support our compliance to the new data management sharing policy. And so happy to talk with you, Janine, about what what your needs might be. Again, I think we're going to have to balance what the institution provides as part of just indirects and research support versus what goes beyond those costs and should be placed on the budgets of the grants, right? So some of the money for that comes in through the indirects, but some of the money for larger management projects are going to have to be budgeted on grants. One of the challenges is that the size of the grant funding wise doesn't necessarily relate to the amount of data or the cost of managing the data. So you could have a very small R21 grant that could generate an enormous amount of data, but not necessarily have the budget to actually manage those data. And so this is going to be where I think NIH is going to start to see some tensions. And we as an institution are going to have to come up with a cost model to help balance that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the last question, if there's still time. Is there still time for one more question?
Yep, plenty of time.
Okay, great. Oh, and I will, let me just share the slides here. Okay, should be able to get to the link now. Okay, so the next question is, what support do you need to address the NIH data management and sharing plan? What would be most helpful to you in getting ready for this new plan? And again, I think, we've had grants that have been over 500,000 a year, direct costs, or genomic sharing, data sharing activities have already had to write data management plans. This one is also additionally focused on the sharing part, not just the management part. So for programs like that, it's not a whole lot different other than the format and the sort of very, ticking boxes of specific content types. But for investigators that, haven't, been used to writing those types of plans, I think that's where we really want to understand what additional support would be most useful to you all now as we get ready for January. Let's see if I have any questions. And I'll just mention that, if you go to the slides, there are links to the survey. You can reach us at creo@cuinshoots.edu. And we are happy to meet with any groups to go over your needs or our ideas for what might be most supportive as you guys get ready for this process. I think for some groups, it will be, essentially not much different than the status quo. For other groups, there may need to be resources created for you. There may need to be, data curation performed. They may need to be new data locations created, and just otherwise documentation relating to how the data is actually going to be managed. So we really want to hear the diversity of needs. We're doing our very best in the working group to try to understand that landscape across the whole research enterprise. And again, I just wanted to encourage anybody who's especially interested in supporting any of the units that please be welcome to join the working group. Anyone want to speak up or any other questions? I should also mention we're going to be doing more regular town halls on this between now and January, and probably subsequent to that as well. So this won't be the last that you'll hear from us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melissa. And I just want to reiterate that we will be sending the recording and the slides out at the end of the week as well, so you'll have access to those. Before we wrap up with a couple of final updates, I just want to launch one final poll for our audience. This will help us gauge, future topics and needs of the folks who attend Clinical Research Connections. Natasha, if you could launch this. This is related to challenges that you face and opportunities for us to provide education and solutions in your role in clinical research. This one is multiple choice. I'll give everybody just a couple of moments to answer that. Oh, and thank you, Natasha, for sharing the link to past recordings of Clinical Research Connections in the chat. All right, if everybody has had a chance to answer that poll, Natasha, if you wouldn't mind sharing the results. Turnover, I know we've all struggled with that. Thank you for sharing. This will help us gauge future topics that we can discuss here. So before we wrap up, I just want to pass it over to Allison Lakin for some quick updates, and then we'll close out.
I don't have a lot that's on the horizon, but one thing that I just wanted to reiterate was what Sam was talking about was please reach out to the research pharmacy if you have a protocol that is currently being managed by the hospital pharmacy and it's going to be using resources in the outpatient CTRC. So we need to get those transferred. The hospital is keen for us to do that. The other issue that is being worked on, it is hard to get details on, but the hospital pharmacy stock room is contemplating or is communicating that they will no longer be available for to provide product on campus. We're working through that. I'm hoping we'll have something for you at a future meeting. But please, if you've got an immediate need, I don't know if Sam's still there, but Sam is trying to work with people, but we know that this is an issue and we're trying to work through it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you guys have needs, reach out to us in the CU Research Pharmacy, and And we'll do our best. We're working through developing additional contracts for purchasing and trying to get a better lay of the land of what our researchers need on campus. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us as a starting place, and then we'll do our best to navigate those situations.
Yeah, and as we get more information and there's a clearer plan in place, we'll come back and share. The other thing that you just may hear, and I just want to plant it as we currently have a level of resources for IND IDE support. Some of those in the Clinical Research Support Center in Clinical Research Administration. Some of those are in Ben Escalia's shop and CTOP. We are looking to consolidate, and so at a future meeting we will be talking about starting to provide some more mandatory centralized support for INDs and IDEs. So just in case you hear rumor, part of that is being pushed by the campus moving to having a cell therapy institute on campus, and some of it has been in the pipeline for a while. So look forward to sharing that with you. I think that's all I have.
All right, thank you very much, Allison, and thank you very much to our presenters today. The November 15th date is available for registration for Clinical Research Connections. We will then be skipping December and January, and we will resume February 21st. So we will see you in November, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you everybody for joining us.